If God loves the whole world, why does so much of the Bible focus on one nation? Why Abraham? Why Israel? Why the long story of one family, one people, one land, one law, one temple, and one set of promises? At first glance, it can seem as though the Bible narrows from the whole world down to a small corner of it. And that can leave people with a serious question. Did God choose Israel because the other nations mattered less? The Bible's answer is almost the opposite. Israel was not chosen instead of the nations. Israel was chosen for the nations. That single idea changes the way the whole story fits together. The Bible does not begin with Israel. It begins with humanity. It begins with a world made by God, a human family made in His image, and a blessing meant to fill the earth. Israel enters the story later, after humanity has become divided, scattered, violent, and lost. God calls one family not to build a wall around His love, but to carry His blessing into a fractured world. So this is not a story about God caring for one group while ignoring everyone else. It is the story of how God begins His rescue plan through one people so that every people can be invited home. The pattern is simple once you see it. A scattered world. One family called. One people formed. One mission carried. One Messiah sent. Every nation invited. And the question we will keep returning to is this: why would a God who created every nation begin His rescue plan through one nation? To answer that, we have to go back before Israel existed. Before Abraham, before Moses, before Egypt, before there were nations with borders, languages, histories, armies, and names. The Bible begins with humanity as one family. In Genesis, God creates a world that is good. He gives human beings life, purpose, work, relationship, and a place to belong. Adam and Eve are not presented as the ancestors of one special ethnic group. They are presented as humanity. The first blessing is broad. Be fruitful, fill the earth, care for creation. Reflect the God who made you. The opening vision of the Bible is not a tiny private community. It is a world full of human life lived under the goodness of God. Every person, before there is any distinction of language or nation, bears God's image. That matters because it tells us something about the heart of the story. God's concern for the world is not an afterthought added near the end of the New Testament. The whole human family belongs in the frame from the very beginning, but the first human family breaks trust with God. Adam and Eve choose to define good and evil on their own terms. Shame enters. Fear enters. Blame enters. They hide from God and turn against each other. The relationship between humanity and God fractures, and the fractures spread outward. The ground becomes hard. Work becomes painful. Death enters the story. People who were made for life with God are sent out of the garden. This is the first exile. It happens before there is Israel. It happens before there are nations. The deepest human problem is not first political, ethnic, or geographical. It is spiritual and relational. Humanity is made for God, but humanity has become separated from the one who gives life. And once that break happens, division starts multiplying. Cain kills Abel. Violence grows, families fracture, pride becomes a way of life. By the time we reach the flood, the earth is described as filled with violence. The Bible is showing us that sin does not stay inside one private decision. It spills into homes, communities, societies, and eventually the whole world. After the flood, God preserves Noah and his family and makes a covenant with creation. The world receives another beginning, but it does not take long for the old problem to return. A new world cannot automatically produce a new heart. Humanity still wants to build its life without God at the center. That is what the story of Babel is about. People gather together and decide to build a city with a tower that reaches toward heaven. They want to make a name for themselves. They want security, greatness, and unity on their own terms. The issue is not that cities are bad, or that building is wrong, or that people should never cooperate. The issue is the same old desire from Eden, to take control of life apart from God, to make ourselves the center, to define our own greatness. Babel is humanity trying to unite without God, and the result is not true unity. Languages divide, people scatter, nations spread across the earth. What began as one human family becomes a world of separated peoples, separated languages, separated identities, and often separated loyalties. Babel is not simply a strange, ancient story about languages. It is the Bible's picture of a fragmented world. People want belonging, but they build belonging by excluding others. They want security, but they build it through fear. They want a name, so they treat other names as threats. They want unity, but they try to create it without truth, humility, or God. That scattered world is the immediate background for Abraham. Genesis 11 ends with the nations spread out. Genesis 12 begins with God calling one man. This is one of the most important transitions in the Bible. God does not look at the scattered nations and say, "I am done with all of you. I will only care about one family from now on." Instead, he begins a plan that starts with one family and is aimed at every family. God says to Abraham, in essence, "Leave your country, leave the familiar world you know, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. And through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed." That last line is the key. All the families of the earth. God calls one man after Babel because Babel has left the world scattered. He chooses one family because the human family is fractured. He makes a promise to Abraham because the nations need blessing. Israel's story begins not as an alternative to the nations, but as God's answer to the nations' division. This is why Abraham's calling is so much bigger than a private promise about descendants or land. Abraham is not simply being offered a better life for himself. He is being drawn into a mission that reaches outward. God will form a people through him, but the purpose of that people is not to become an isolated religious island. The purpose is that blessing will one day flow through them to the world. You can think of it like a river. God does not choose Abraham to be a lake that stores blessing for itself. He chooses him to become the beginning of a river. The blessing comes through one family, but it is always moving toward every family. And Abraham is not chosen because he is obviously superior. The Bible never presents him that way. Abraham has courage, but he also has fear. He trusts God, but he also tries to manage God's promise in his own way. He waits, but he also becomes impatient. He obeys, but he also has moments of compromise. The point is not that God found the one flawless person on earth. The point is that God's purpose rests on God's faithfulness. That matters because being chosen in the Bible is not a trophy. It is a calling. To be chosen is not to be told, "You are better than everyone else." It is to be told, "You have been given a role in something bigger than yourself." A doctor is chosen for a difficult operation, not because everyone else is worthless, but because someone must carry a responsibility for the good of others. A messenger is chosen not to keep the message private, but to deliver it. In the same way, Abraham is chosen to carry a promise that reaches beyond Abraham. The promise grows through his family. Isaac is born when hope seems impossible. Jacob becomes Israel. His 12 sons become the beginning of a people. But the story does not move in a straight line. The family is full of rivalry, deception, grief, betrayal, and reconciliation. The Bible does not hide the mess. It shows us that God's plan moves through real human lives, not polished heroes. Eventually, through Joseph, Abraham's family ends up in Egypt. At first, Egypt is a place of survival. A famine threatens the family, and Joseph's position provides food and safety. But generations pass. The family becomes a people, and the people become slaves. This is where the promise appears to be buried. How can Abraham's descendants bless the nations when they are trapped inside an empire? How can the family God promised to use for the world become a people without freedom, without land, without power, and without a future? The answer is that God is not finished. In fact, the next great part of the story will show why Israel must first be rescued before it can understand its calling. Before Israel can become a blessing, it must learn what it means to receive blessing. Before it can show the nations what life with God looks like, it must be brought out of slavery itself. Before it can become a priestly people, it must be rescued by the God who hears the cry of the oppressed. So the story moves from a scattered world to one family, from one family to a people, and from a people into Egypt. It may look like the promise has narrowed and failed, but God is preparing to reveal something through Israel that the nations need to see. The God of the Bible is the God who hears, comes down, rescues, and makes a people for His purpose. And that brings us back to the question: why begin with one nation if God loves the whole world? Because a scattered world needs more than a general idea. It needs a story. It needs a people through whom God's character can become visible. It needs a living witness that God does not abandon slaves, that He does not ignore injustice, that He can create freedom, and that He can dwell with human beings again. There is another reason this beginning matters. God's way of working through one particular family does not mean He has become less interested in the whole human family. It shows that God chooses to work through real history. He speaks to people with names, families, fears, and places. He does not save the world through an abstract slogan. He begins a story that can be remembered, told, sung, carried, and eventually shared. The particular and the universal belong together in the Bible. God loves every nation, but He begins with Abraham. God cares about the whole earth, but He gives one family a concrete promise. That can seem narrow only if we forget the direction of the promise. God's choice has an arrow built into it. It moves outward. Abraham is blessed so that blessing can spread. This also explains why the Bible spends so much time with the failures and ordinary details of Abraham's family. The point is not to create an ethnic legend about a perfect people. It is to show that God can carry a purpose through human weakness. Sarah laughs. Jacob deceives. Joseph's brothers sell him. Families break and are slowly restored. Yet God's promise keeps moving. If the plan depended on human greatness, it would end almost immediately. It survives because God remains faithful. By the time Israel is enslaved in Egypt, the family of Abraham has become large enough to be seen as a people. But it is still not a powerful nation. It has no land, no army, no throne, no public honor. It is vulnerable. That is not an accident. The Bible wants us to see that the coming rescue will not be the achievement of a naturally superior people. It will be the work of the God who keeps promises. And that gives the first answer to our question: Why one nation? Not because God's love became small, but because God was preparing a people to carry a big story. A scattered world needed to see that the God of creation could form a family across generations, rescue slaves from empire, teach them justice, dwell among them, correct them when they failed, and still keep his promise moving toward the nations. But carrying a story is not the same as completing it. Israel will soon discover that being chosen does not remove fear, weakness, or the need for grace. The family promised to bless the nations will become slaves in Egypt, and the God who called Abraham will have to reveal, through a rescue no empire can stop, what his purpose for this people has always been. Israel grows in Egypt, but not in the way Abraham might have imagined when he first heard God's promise. His descendants become numerous, but they do not become free. They are forced to labor under Pharaoh. Their children are threatened. Their lives are controlled by a system that sees them as useful only when they can produce more bricks, more wealth, more power for someone else. This is not a side detail in the Bible's story. Egypt becomes the great picture of what happens when human power turns people into tools. Pharaoh does not know the God of Abraham, and he does not see Israel as a people with dignity. He sees a threat to manage and a workforce to exploit. And then God hears their cry. The God who called Abraham has not forgotten Abraham's descendants. The God who promised blessing has not become distant from people in chains. He sees. He remembers. He comes down to deliver them. He calls Moses, not because Moses feels capable, but because the rescue does not depend on Moses being impressive. It depends on God being faithful. The Exodus is one of the clearest declarations in the whole Bible about the character of God. He is not neutral toward oppression. He is not impressed by the wealth and armies of Egypt. He hears the powerless. He confronts Pharaoh. He makes a way where there is no way. He brings his people through the sea. Israel does not walk out of Egypt because it has earned freedom. It walks out because God has acted in mercy. That order matters. God rescues before he gives the law. He saves before he sends. He brings a people out of slavery before he tells them how they are meant to live. At Sinai, after the sea has opened and the people have been delivered, God gives Israel a calling that explains why it exists. He tells them that they are to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Those words can sound distant to modern ears, but they are central to the whole story. A priest is not simply someone who performs rituals for himself. A priest represents God's presence and helps make a way for others to come near. A priestly people is a people whose life is meant to display the God it serves. Israel is not chosen to keep God locked inside its borders. Israel is chosen to become a visible witness to what life with the true God can look like. This does not mean Israel is supposed to dominate the other nations. It means Israel is meant to live differently among them. The nations are often built around power, conquest, fear, and the worship of things that cannot give life. Israel is called to show another way. Worship the God who created all things. Tell the truth, protect life, rest, care for the stranger, defend the vulnerable, refuse idols, remember mercy, and live as people who were once slaves. That is why the law includes commands about worship and commands about ordinary social life. Israel's faith is not meant to be a private set of beliefs hidden inside a temple. It is meant to shape markets, homes, courts, harvests, debts, families, work, and rest. The God who rescued Israel from Egypt does not want Israel to rebuild Egypt inside Israel. Think about the Sabbath. Israel is commanded to stop working one day every week. Not only landowners. Servants rest. Children rest. animals rest. The stranger within the community rests. Why? Because Israel knows what it means to live under a system where human value is measured only by output. They were slaves. God is teaching them that people are not machines. Their dignity does not come from endless labor. Their lives belong to Him. The laws about care for strangers carry the same memory. Israel is repeatedly told to remember that it was once a stranger in Egypt. That memory is meant to produce mercy. The people who have received rescue are called to make room for those who are vulnerable. The people who have been shown compassion are called to show compassion. Their distinctiveness is not supposed to become pride. It is supposed to become witness. This is why Israel's election is not simply about receiving special blessings. It comes with responsibility. God gives Israel a story, a covenant, and a way of life that are meant to make His character visible in the world. That does not mean Israel always succeeds. In fact, the rest of the Old Testament makes clear that Israel struggles with the same sins as every other nation. It worships idols. It fears enemies. It abuses power. It exploits the poor. It forgets the God who rescued it. The Bible does not flatter Israel. It tells its failures as honestly as it tells anyone else's failures. This is important because it keeps us from misunderstanding what chosen means. Chosen does not mean immune to judgment. It does not mean automatically faithful. It does not mean every action of Israel is approved by God. Israel's calling is real, but its failures are real too. The story is not that God found one naturally righteous nation while everyone else remained hopeless. The story is that God works through a real people who need the same grace, correction, forgiveness, and transformation as everyone else. Even Israel's failure becomes part of the wider lesson. If the people chosen to carry God's law cannot save themselves simply by having the law, then the whole world needs a deeper rescue. If Israel can have the temple, the sacrifices, the prophets, and the memory of Exodus, and still struggle with idolatry and injustice, then no nation can claim that external religion alone will heal the human heart. But God does not abandon His purpose when Israel fails. He keeps calling the people back. He keeps sending prophets. He keeps reminding them that their story is larger than their own comfort or safety. The tabernacle and later the temple are part of that calling. God chooses to dwell among Israel. This is astonishing. The presence lost in Eden is not forgotten. God does not merely send commands from a distance. He comes near. The tabernacle stands in the center of the camp, and later the temple stands in Jerusalem, declaring that the God who made heaven and earth desires to live among human beings. Yet even the temple is never meant to become a private possession. It is a sign of God's presence. But the prophets constantly push Israel beyond the idea that God can be owned. The God of Israel is not a local deity trapped in one building. He is the creator of every people. His presence among Israel is meant to reveal who He is, not to shrink Him down. This is why the prophets repeatedly widen the horizon. They speak to Israel in moments of failure, fear, exile, and return. But they keep seeing the nations in the future God is preparing. Isaiah imagines nations coming to God's light. Micah imagines peoples streaming toward the mountain of the Lord to learn His ways. Zechariah speaks of many nations joining themselves to the Lord. The Psalms repeatedly call all peoples, all lands, and all nations to praise God. The prophets are not telling Israel to stop being Israel. They are reminding Israel what its calling has always been for. The blessing promised to Abraham was never supposed to stop at Abraham's descendants. The nations were in the promise from the beginning. This is especially important when Israel experiences exile. Israel loses its land, its city, and its temple. The people are carried away into foreign lands. On the surface, it might seem as though the whole mission has failed. How can Israel be a light to the nations when it is weak, displaced, and grieving? How can it show the power of God when its own city lies in ruins? But the prophets speak hope even there. They say that God's purpose is not finished. Israel's failure will not erase God's faithfulness. Exile exposes the need for a deeper restoration, but it does not cancel the promise. In fact, the vision becomes even wider. God will bring his people home. He will give them new hearts. He will pour out his Spirit. He will make justice and peace visible, and the nations will see what God has done. There is a moment in the story of Jonah that makes this tension very personal. Jonah is sent to Nineveh, the capital of a violent enemy empire. He does not want to go. He knows that God is merciful, and he does not want mercy to reach people he considers undeserving. Jonah's struggle is not only about fear, it is about the question that runs through the whole Bible. Can God's mercy really be wide enough for people we do not want included? The book of Jonah refuses to let Israel's calling become a story of exclusion. God cares about Nineveh. He sees a city full of people who do not know their right hand from their left. People caught inside a violent world. People who need warning and mercy. Jonah wants a smaller story. God keeps insisting on a larger one. That is a message the Bible repeats in many forms. Israel is called to be distinct, but its distinctiveness is meant to serve a universal purpose. The God who says, "You will be my people," is the same God who says through Abraham, "All families of the earth will be blessed." The God who gives Israel a law is the same God whose prophets picture the nations learning his ways. The God who dwells in the temple is the same God who promises that his glory will fill the earth. The prophets also make clear that Israel's calling to the nations is not a vague idea about everyone eventually being nice to one another. It is connected to the character of God. The nations are meant to see justice where there was exploitation, mercy where there was cruelty, truth where there was deception, and worship of the Creator instead of fear of idols. God's light is not merely information. It is a life that reveals what He is like. This is why Israel's own injustice is treated so seriously. A people called to display God's character cannot keep using the same violence, greed, and contempt found around them, and still imagine they are fulfilling their mission. The prophets confront Israel precisely because its calling matters. They call the people back not only for their own good, but because the world is meant to see something true about God through them. Even when the people are scattered into exile, the promise is not reduced to survival. God speaks of restoration that will become visible to the nations. He speaks of a future in which His name will be honored not because Israel has made itself impressive, but because God has shown His faithfulness. The mission is still alive, but it is waiting for a fulfillment greater than Israel can create by itself. So why would a God who loves the whole world begin with one nation? Because God's rescue works through history, through people, through a story that can be seen and remembered. He forms Israel to carry a witness. The Creator is not distant. Oppression is not final. Idols cannot give life. Justice matters, mercy matters, and God desires to dwell with people. But Israel cannot complete this mission by its own strength. The law reveals God's character, but it cannot force people to love that character. The temple shows God's nearness, but it cannot automatically remove the distance inside the human heart. The prophets point toward a future, but they themselves are still waiting for it. By the end of the Old Testament, the question has become even sharper. Israel has carried the promise, but who will fulfill the promise? Israel has been called to bless the nations, but who will bring that blessing to every nation? Israel has been called a priestly people, but who will finally bring people near to God? Israel has heard that the nations will come to God's light, but how will that happen? The answer begins with Jesus. Before we move there, pause and consider what surprises you most about Israel's calling. Is it that Abraham is called immediately after Babel? Is it that Israel is called a kingdom of priests? Is it that the law includes care for strangers because Israel was once a stranger? Or is it that the prophets never stop talking about the nations? Those questions are not details at the edge of the Bible. They are part of its main direction. One family becomes one nation, not so that the rest of the world will be pushed away, but so that the world will one day see the God who makes a way home. And Jesus enters that story not as someone who throws Israel's story aside, but as the one who brings its mission to the point it was always moving toward. Jesus is born into Israel's story. That is not a minor detail. He is not introduced as the founder of a separate religion with no connection to what came before. The New Testament places him inside the promises, questions, hopes, and failures of Israel. His family line reaches back through Abraham. His birth is announced with the language of God's faithfulness. He grows up inside the life of Israel. He is baptized in the Jordan. He goes into the wilderness. He gathers 12 disciples, echoing the 12 tribes. He speaks about the kingdom of God. He enters Jerusalem. He teaches in the temple. Jesus steps into Israel's story because Israel's story is where God's promise for the nations has been carried. But Jesus does not simply repeat what came before. He fulfills it. Israel was called to be a light to the nations. Jesus calls himself the light of the world. Israel was called to be a priestly people. Jesus brings people near to God. Israel was rescued from slavery in Egypt. Jesus speaks about a deeper freedom from sin, fear, and death. Israel carried the promise of Abraham. Jesus becomes the place where that promise opens outward to every people. This does not mean Israel was only a temporary symbol with no real role. It means the story reaches its intended fulfillment in the one Israel's scriptures had been preparing us to recognize. Jesus carries Israel's calling faithfully, where Israel, like every human people, had failed to carry it perfectly. You can see this in the way Jesus moves. Much of his ministry begins among the people of Israel. He calls them back to the God of their covenant. He heals their sick, confronts the ways they have turned religion into burden, and announces that God's kingdom has come near. But from the beginning, there are signs that his mission cannot be contained within expected boundaries. He speaks with a Samaritan woman whom many would avoid. He heals the servant of a Roman centurion and marvels at the man's faith. He responds to the plea of a Canaanite woman. He tells stories where outsiders become examples of mercy. He speaks of people coming from east and west to sit at the table in God's kingdom. Again and again, Jesus shows that the mercy of God is wider than the lines people use to decide who belongs. This is not Jesus rejecting Israel. It is Jesus bringing Israel's mission into view. The promise to Abraham was that every family of the earth would be blessed. The prophets saw nations coming to God's light. Jesus is showing that this future is beginning. He also shows that the deepest problem dividing people is not only language, culture, or history. Those things are real. They shape how people see the world. They can become sources of beauty, memory, and identity. But beneath all of them is a deeper shared condition. Human beings are separated from God and from one another by sin, fear, pride, and hostility. That is why the cross matters so much in this story. At the cross, Jesus does not merely die as an individual hero. He carries the weight of a divided human world. He is betrayed by a friend, rejected by many of his own people, handed over to foreign power, mocked by leaders, and executed outside the city. The cross gathers the world's deepest fractures in one place: religious pride, political violence, fear, betrayal, scapegoating, and death. And Jesus enters that place without returning violence for violence. This is where God's plan for every nation reaches deeper than a political alliance or a shared culture. The cross deals with the barrier between humanity and God. It opens a way for people who are far away to come near. It exposes the sin that lives in every nation, every tribe, every family, and every heart. And it creates the possibility of a new people whose unity is not built on sameness, domination, or exclusion, but on mercy. The cross does not erase the nations. It does not erase languages, histories, or cultures, as if God only wants one bland human identity. It removes the wall of hostility that turns differences into reasons for contempt. It makes peace possible where human beings have learned to define themselves by opposition to one another. This is one of the reasons the New Testament describes the work of Jesus as creating one new humanity. That does not mean people become identical. It means the old system of worth, status, hostility, and separation no longer has the final word. People who once stood far apart can become family around Jesus. Then comes the resurrection. The one who was rejected rises. Death, the power that has shadowed every nation and every human story, does not hold him. This matters for the nations because the promise was never only about people learning to get along better. It was about God making a new creation. The resurrection is the first sign that the future God promised is beginning. After the resurrection, Jesus gives his followers a mission that makes the direction of the whole Bible unmistakable. They are sent outward. The good news is not meant to remain in one city. It will move from Jerusalem to Judea, to Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. The story that began with one family now begins moving openly toward every family. Pentecost is one of the most beautiful moments in that movement. At Babel, human beings tried to make one name for themselves without God. The result was confusion, division, and scattering. Languages became part of the story of separation. At Pentecost, people from many places gather in Jerusalem. They speak different languages. They come from different regions and cultures. And when the Spirit comes, each hears the message in their own language. That does not mean Pentecost erases Babel in the sense of making everyone speak the same language again. It does something more beautiful. God does not erase difference in order to create unity. He makes the good news understandable within difference. The message reaches people where they are. They do not have to become culturally identical before they can hear that God has come near. Pentecost is a reversal of Babel, but not a reversal into sameness. At Babel, people cannot understand one another because they are trying to build unity without God. At Pentecost, people from many languages are gathered around the work of God. The center is no longer human pride. The center is Jesus. This is why the church becomes such an important sign in the New Testament. The church is not meant to be a club for people who already look alike, vote alike, speak alike, or come from the same family history. It is meant to be a new family formed around the risen Christ. Jews and Gentiles, people near and people far, insiders and outsiders, people from every social level and cultural background, are invited into one shared life. That does not mean the early church finds this easy. The book of Acts is honest about the struggle. Peter has to learn that God's mercy is reaching Gentiles. The first believers have to wrestle with what it means for Gentiles to belong without first becoming culturally Jewish. There are misunderstandings, fears, arguments, and moments of real breakthrough. The expanding mission is not a smooth human success story. It is the work of the Spirit pushing people beyond the boundaries they would have chosen for themselves. The story of Cornelius shows this powerfully. Cornelius is a Roman centurion, part of the system that represented foreign occupation. Yet God meets him. Peter is sent to him. Peter realizes that God does not show favoritism in the narrow human sense. The good news reaches a man many people would have placed outside the story. It is not because Israel no longer matters. It is because the promise given through Israel is doing what it was always meant to do. The Apostle Paul carries this message across the Mediterranean world. He goes to synagogues and cities, speaks to Jews and Gentiles, and announces that in Jesus, the blessing of Abraham is reaching the nations. His letters wrestle with the practical reality of communities where people with different histories, food practices, social positions, and cultural instincts are learning to live as one body. This is not an easy unity. It requires humility. It requires patience. It requires people to stop treating their own background as the only possible center of God's work. But that is exactly what the gospel creates. A family larger than any single ethnicity, nation, class, or language. The Bible's final vision takes this even further. Revelation does not end with all nations disappearing. It does not picture a future where human diversity is flattened into one anonymous crowd. It shows a redeemed multitude from every tribe, language, people, and nation standing before God. The nations are not forgotten. They are healed. That is the final answer to the question we began with. Why did God choose Israel if He loves the whole world? Because the whole world was always the goal. God begins with one family after Babel so that the scattered families of the earth can be blessed. He forms one people in Egypt so that His character can become visible in the world. He gives Israel a calling, a law, prophets, worship, and a story so that the nations can one day see what the true God is like. Israel's failure reveals that no human people can complete this mission by its own strength. Jesus fulfills the calling. The Spirit carries the message into every language, and new creation gathers every nation in the presence of God. This does not make Israel unimportant. It shows why Israel's story matters so much. Without Abraham, we do not understand the promise. Without Exodus, we do not understand rescue. Without the law, we do not see the shape of life with God. Without the prophets, we do not see the widening horizon of God's plan. Without Israel's scriptures, we do not understand the language Jesus fulfills. At the same time, it keeps us from turning election into arrogance. God's choosing is never permission to look down on others. In the Bible, chosen people are chosen to serve, to witness, to carry responsibility, and to become a blessing. Israel's calling points beyond itself because God's love always points outward. This gives us a different way to read the entire Bible. It begins with all humanity made in God's image. It shows humanity scattered at Babel. It calls Abraham for the sake of all families. It forms Israel to be a priestly people. It sends prophets who keep the nations in view. It sends Jesus into Israel's story to fulfill its mission. It pours out the Spirit so every language can hear. And it ends with every tribe, language, people, and nation gathered around God. One family, one people, one Messiah, every nation. And this is not just a map of ancient history. It changes how we understand belonging. The Bible tells us that no nation, culture, language, or group gets to claim God as a private possession. God is not the property of one people. He is the creator of all people. He does not erase the particular stories he works through, but he never lets those stories become prisons that lock others out. The God of Abraham is the God of every family. The God who heard Israel in Egypt is the God who hears the oppressed everywhere. The God who gave Israel a calling is the God who invites people from every background into his mercy. The God revealed in Jesus is not smaller than the world. He is the Lord who is bringing the world home. That does not mean every difference between peoples vanishes in this life. It does not mean history, pain, injustice, and conflict become simple. The Bible is far too honest for that. But it gives a final hope strong enough to face those realities. God is creating a people who can be different without being enemies, who can be many without being divided, and who can be united without being made identical. The final vision is not one nation swallowing up every other nation. It is the nations healed. It is people from every language worshiping together. It is a city whose gates are open. It is God dwelling with humanity. It is the scattered family of Babel finally brought home, not by human achievement, but by the mercy of God. So remember the path one last time. Humanity begins as one family. Sin brings division. Babel scatters the nations. Abraham is called for every family. Israel is rescued and formed as a priestly people. The prophets keep the nations in view. Jesus fulfills Israel's mission. The cross brings the far near. Pentecost speaks in every language. The Spirit forms one family from many peoples. New creation gathers every tribe, language, people, and nation. God chose Israel not because the other nations did not matter. He chose Israel because every nation mattered enough to be included in his plan. One nation was chosen so every nation could be invited home.